Why you think everyone is doing better than you. You're scrolling through your phone, seeing someone's promotion, someone else's engagement, another person's vacation, and somewhere in the background of your mind, a quiet conclusion forms. Everyone is doing better than me. It feels like a fact. It isn't. You're comparing your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. One of the most misleading habits the mind falls into is comparing what you know about your own life to what you see of other people's. On your side, you have full access, the doubts that show up at 2 a.m., the moments of procrastination you don't talk about, the failed attempts, the awkward conversations, the plans that didn't work out, and the private frustration of trying again when no one is watching. Your life, to you, is unedited. It includes every scene, not just the finished ones. On the other side, you're mostly seeing highlights. What gets shown publicly, whether on social media, in conversations, or even in professional settings, is rarely the full process. People tend to share promotions, achievements, milestones, celebrations, and moments that feel worth marking. Even when they are honest about struggle, it is usually a summarized version, not the day-by-day emotional experience behind it. You see the graduation photo, not the nights of uncertainty that came before it. You see the vacation, not the stress that made it feel necessary. You see the confident presentation, not the rehearsals where everything went wrong. The mind doesn't naturally account for this imbalance. It takes visible outcomes and unconsciously assumes comparable effort, comparable struggle, and comparable timing. So, when you stack someone else's highlight reel against your behind-the-scenes reality, the comparison is already unfair before it begins. It's like comparing a movie trailer to your entire uncut life. This creates a subtle distortion. Other people start to look like they are consistently succeeding, while you feel like you are consistently in progress or even behind. But what you're actually seeing is not their whole story. It's the most shareable parts of it. Every person you compare yourself to has their own hidden footage, uncertainty they don't broadcast, setbacks they don't post about, and days where nothing feels as put together as it appears from the outside. There's also a psychological layer to this. Your brain is far more familiar with your own struggles than anyone else's. Familiarity amplifies flaws. You replay your mistakes in high resolution because you experience them firsthand. Meanwhile, other people's lives are viewed in low resolution, smooth, simplified, and missing detail. That difference alone can make their lives feel more successful, even when they are navigating challenges similar to yours. Over time, this comparison habit can quietly reshape your self-perception. Instead of seeing your progress as a continuous process, you start measuring it against isolated moments of others' success. And because those moments are designed or naturally tend to be positive, the comparison becomes a moving target you can't realistically match. The important shift is recognizing what is actually being compared. It's not your full life against their full life. It's your full reality against their selected moments. Once that becomes clear, the imbalance doesn't disappear, but it becomes visible, and what is visible is easier to question. Your brain is wired to notice what you lack. Your mind is not built to make you feel content all the time. It is built to keep you alive, which means it is constantly scanning for problems, gaps, and risks. That system was useful when survival depended on noticing danger, scarcity, and threats in the environment. But in a modern world where physical survival is usually not the immediate concern, that same wiring often shows up in a different form, a constant awareness of what is missing. This is why it is so easy to focus on what you haven't achieved yet instead of what you have already built. Your brain naturally highlights the unfinished over the completed, the lacking over the sufficient. Even when you make progress, the mind quickly adjusts its baseline. What once felt like a goal becomes the new normal, and attention immediately shifts to the next gap. This process is called hedonic adaptation, and it quietly resets your sense of satisfaction over and over again. So, when you look at your life, your attention doesn't land evenly across everything. It doesn't give equal weight to your stability, your skills, your relationships, your growth, and your efforts. Instead, it tends to zoom in on the areas that feel incomplete, the job you don't have yet, the money you wish you had saved, the version of yourself you're still trying to become, the opportunities that seem to exist for other people, but not for you. Meanwhile, the things that are working tend to fade into the background, not because they are unimportant, but because they are not urgent to the brain's monitoring system. You don't wake up each day actively thinking, "My health is okay. My ability to learn is improving. I've survived every difficult day so far." Those facts exist, but they don't trigger the same emotional signal as what feels missing. This creates a subtle imbalance in perception. Your life becomes defined less by what is present and more by what is absent. Even when you are objectively doing fine, or even well, the mind constructs a narrative of insufficiency simply because it is more sensitive to gaps than to completions. Social comparison intensifies this effect. When you observe others, you are often seeing what your brain already prefers to notice: completed outcomes, visible wins, and signs of progress. That reinforces the idea that you are lacking something, because your attention naturally latches onto what appears more developed in others, while filtering out your own steady progress. The challenge is not that your brain is malfunctioning, it is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The issue is that the environment has changed, but the attention system has not. Instead of scanning for food shortages or immediate threats, it now scans for status gaps, missed milestones, and perceived delays in life progress. The result is a quiet but persistent feeling of being behind, even when there is no clear standard you are actually failing to meet. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the bias, but it does make it visible. And once you see that your attention is naturally drawn toward what is missing, you can start to question whether that focus is telling you something useful, or simply repeating a pattern that was never designed for the kind of life you are living now. Invisible standards shape more of your life than you realize. Most people assume they evaluate their lives according to personal values and independent thinking, but much of that evaluation is actually guided by expectations they absorbed without noticing. Over time, ideas from family, education, culture, social media, and peer comparison quietly shape an internal blueprint for what a successful life should look like and when each stage of it should happen. The issue is that these expectations often go unquestioned. They operate in the background as silent assumptions. Finish school by a certain age, establish a stable career soon after, become financially secure, build relationships, travel, buy a home, and continue progressing according to a socially accepted timeline. Even without consciously agreeing to these milestones, people often treat them as default measures of progress. When life unfolds differently, the emotional reaction is rarely neutral. The discomfort usually comes not from failure itself, but from comparing reality against standards that may never have truly belonged to you in the first place. These invisible expectations create the feeling of being behind, even though there is no universal timeline that everyone is required to follow. What makes these standards especially difficult is how unevenly they are applied. You may easily accept that others have unique journeys and circumstances, yet still hold yourself to a far stricter standard. When someone else reaches a milestone earlier, it can feel emotionally significant, even though their progress has no direct connection to your own path. Many of these internal timelines are also based on outdated ideas. They often reflect older models of life where careers were predictable, stability was easier to maintain, and success followed a more linear structure. Modern life rarely works that way anymore. People change careers, restart later in life, take unconventional routes, or define fulfillment differently. Still, the mind tends to cling to older frameworks because they feel familiar and measurable. These invisible rules persist because they are emotional before they are rational. You may fully understand that people move at different speeds, yet still feel anxious when your life does not match a specific sequence of events. That tension exists because logic and conditioning are not always aligned. As a result, progress becomes difficult to appreciate accurately. Instead of asking whether you are improving relative to your past self, the mind asks whether you have reached the place you should be by now. That question carries an assumption that there is a correct pace for life and that falling outside of it means falling behind. But the idea of one correct timeline is largely reinforced through repetition and comparison. the more often you see certain patterns presented as normal, the more your mind accepts them as objective standards. Over time, repeated social patterns begin to feel like universal truths, even when they are simply common narratives. Recognizing these invisible rules does not erase them immediately, but it weakens their control. Once you see them as inherited assumptions rather than objective facts, you gain the ability to question them, redefine them, or stop measuring yourself against them entirely. You rarely see the hidden costs behind success. Success is usually visible only after it has already taken shape. People see the promotion, the thriving business, the finished project, the confident performance, or the public milestone. What remains hidden is the long, and often difficult process that made those outcomes possible. Beneath nearly every achievement are costs that rarely receive attention. There is the time invested, hours of repetition, focus, sacrifice, and persistence that never appear in a highlight reel. There is the emotional strain of uncertainty, pressure, self-doubt, and frustration. There are opportunity costs as well, experiences missed, alternate paths abandoned, and trade-offs made quietly in the background. Sometimes there is even a physical cost in the form of exhaustion, stress, or burnout that arrives long after the visible reward. Because these parts are mostly unseen, the mind tends to fill the gaps with inaccurate assumptions. Other people's progress can appear smoother, easier, or less complicated than it actually was. This creates an unfair comparison where you measure your complete internal experience against someone else's carefully visible outcome. Most people are not deliberately hiding their struggles. It is simply that struggle is less visible than achievement. Social environments naturally emphasize results over process. People are more likely to share where they arrived than every difficult moment it took to get there. Over time, this creates an incomplete understanding of what success really involves. There is also a tendency to simplify other people's stories into neat narratives. The setbacks become quick side notes instead of long periods of uncertainty. Failures become brief lessons rather than emotionally exhausting experiences. The messy reality gets compressed into a cleaner version that appears far more straightforward than real life usually is. That is why success can look effortless from the outside. You see the outcome without witnessing the repeated failed attempts behind it. You see confidence without seeing the years of insecurity that came before it. You see the polished version without the unfinished drafts, mistakes, or periods of doubt that shaped it. Meanwhile, your own life feels heavier because you experience every part of it directly. You know the uncertainty, the delays, the frustration, and the internal struggles in full detail. The comparison becomes distorted because you are comparing your behind-the-scenes reality to someone else's final presentation. Another important truth is that many people carry difficulties privately. Even close friends and peers often conceal stress, fear, or personal struggles that outsiders never fully see. Someone who appears to be progressing effortlessly may be carrying pressures you know nothing about. When only outcomes are visible, success begins to look cleaner and more linear than it truly is. In reality, progress is often uneven, slow, emotionally demanding, and filled with compromises that remain invisible to everyone except the person living through them. Understanding this does not completely stop comparison, but it adds missing perspective. What appears to be someone else's effortless advantage is often balanced by sacrifices you were never able to witness, and what feels like your own struggle may simply be the visible side of a process that nearly everyone experiences in different forms. Familiarity makes you undervalue your own growth. One of the most overlooked biases in self-perception is familiarity. The more accustomed you become to something, the less significant it appears. Experiences, skills, and achievements that once required enormous effort slowly begin to feel ordinary simply because they have become part of your everyday life. Your own growth is especially affected by this. You no longer experience your achievements the way an outsider would because you have adapted to them gradually. Abilities that once demanded concentration now happen automatically. Situations that once intimidated you now feel routine. As a result, your mind stops recognizing them as evidence of progress and starts treating them as normal background conditions. This creates a quiet distortion. Things that would seem impressive to someone else become almost invisible to you. The familiarity of your own life prevents you from fully noticing how much you have learned, changed, or improved over time. Instead of seeing development, the mind begins to interpret everything as simply how life is now. Growth fades into routine. Other people, however, do not experience your life through that same lens of familiarity. They see your current abilities without the years of adjustment and effort that made them possible. They notice strengths that you overlook because those strengths no longer feel unusual to you. That is often why others can recognize qualities in you that you dismiss as insignificant. What feels ordinary from the inside may actually represent years of adaptation, resilience, discipline, or personal growth that only became invisible through constant exposure. There is also a time-based effect at play. The longer you live with something, your job, your environment, your abilities, the less emotional weight it carries in your perception. This is not because it has become less valuable, but because your attention has adjusted to it. The mind is efficient. Once something is stable, it stops prioritizing it. Stability becomes invisible because it no longer demands attention. This is why personal progress often feels less significant than it actually is. You remember where you wanted to be, but you don't fully register how far you've moved from where you started. The distance traveled becomes harder to perceive. When you are standing in the middle of it every day, you don't get the perspective of contrast that would make the change obvious. Familiarity also affects how you interpret difficulty. Problems that are part of your daily life feel more frustrating than meaningful. Even when they reflect real capability, you might overlook the fact that you are managing responsibilities, relationships, or challenges that once would have felt overwhelming. Because you are accustomed to them, they stop registering as evidence of growth and instead feel like baseline expectations. This is where comparison with others becomes even more misleading. When you compare yourself outwardly, you are not just seeing different outcomes. You are also missing the internal normalization that makes your own outcomes feel less significant. Someone else's unfamiliar success appears larger because it still carries novelty in your perception, while your own achievements have been absorbed into routine. The key realization is that familiarity does not reflect importance. It only reflects exposure. Just because something feels normal does not mean it is small or unremarkable. It simply means you have lived with it long enough for your mind to stop highlighting it. When you account for that, your internal measurement of progress begins to shift. Instead of relying on how something feels, you start to recognize how it would look from outside your own perspective. And from that distance, much of what feels ordinary inside your life begins to look like evidence of real development that you had quietly stopped noticing. You're in a different chapter, not a different outcome. It's easy to look at other people's lives and assume you are witnessing different levels of success on the same timeline. Someone seems ahead, someone else seems settled, and you feel as if you are either catching up or falling behind. But that framing misses something important. Most people are not on the same page of a shared story. They are in entirely different chapters of different stories. A chapter is not just a position in time, it is a stage of development. In one chapter, someone might be building foundations, learning skills, making mistakes, trying paths that don't work yet. In another, someone might be consolidating, stabilizing a career, refining direction, or recovering from earlier decisions. In yet another, someone might be starting over completely. Even if from the outside it looks like they are moving forward, when you compare yourself to others, you often ignore this structure. You take one visible moment of someone's life and treat it as if it represents their entire narrative. If they are succeeding in something you are still working toward, it can feel like proof that you are behind. But what you are actually seeing is not their whole timeline, it is just their current chapter. The difficulty is that chapters don't move in sync across people. There is no universal age or moment where everyone switches from learning to succeeding, from struggling to stabilizing, or from starting to arriving. Life is not organized like a synchronized system, where everyone progresses at the same pace. It is more like a collection of overlapping stories, each unfolding at its own rhythm. This is why comparisons often feel so discouraging. You might be reading your own chapter on uncertainty, while someone else appears to be in a chapter of clarity. But that clarity may have come after years of confusion you didn't witness, or it may still be fragile even if it looks stable. Meanwhile, your current uncertainty may be the necessary phase that builds the foundation for your next stage. It is also important to recognize that chapters are not permanent states. They are transitions, not identities. Feeling stuck in one part of life can make it seem like that is who you are, rather than where you are. But chapters are designed to change. What feels like repetition is often preparation for a shift that only becomes visible in hindsight. Another layer of confusion comes from how people present their lives. Most individuals naturally share the parts of their story that feel resolved or presentable. That means you often encounter others at their highlight chapter, not the earlier or more difficult ones. This creates the illusion that their story is more linear or more successful than yours, when in reality, you are just seeing a different segment. If you step back from comparison, you can start to see that timing is not the same as outcome. Being in a different chapter does not mean being on a different level. It means being in a different phase of development. Someone who appears ahead may simply be in a later stage of a different path, while you are still building the groundwork for yours. The challenge is that it is hard to feel this distinction emotionally, even if it makes sense logically. When your current chapter involves struggle or uncertainty, it can feel like the whole story is defined by that moment. But chapters are temporary by nature. They only feel permanent when you are inside them. Recognizing this doesn't erase the discomfort of where you are, but it reframes it. Instead of measuring yourself against someone else's position in their story, you begin to understand that you are not behind. You are simply somewhere else in your own progression. And in that sense, the only meaningful comparison is not between your chapter and theirs, but between where you are now and where you once were. When you put all of these patterns together, a clearer picture starts to form. The feeling that everyone is doing better than you is rarely about objective reality. It is usually the result of how the mind filters information, assigns meaning, and constructs comparisons. You see highlights instead of full stories, gaps instead of completions, and external outcomes without internal context. On top of that, you measure yourself using inherited rules, overlook your own progress because it feels familiar, and forget that different people are often in entirely different chapters of their lives. None of this means your challenges aren't real or that comparison never happens. It means the conclusion your mind reaches, that you are behind, is often built from incomplete inputs. When the inputs change, the conclusion becomes less certain. What remains consistent is that progress is usually quieter than it appears from the outside. It does not always announce itself with obvious milestones or visible validation. More often, it shows up in accumulated experience, small adaptations, and changes that become noticeable only when you look back. So the question shifts from why is everyone ahead of me to something more accurate. What am I not fully seeing about my own path? And what am I assuming about theirs? That shift doesn't solve everything, but it restores a sense of proportion. And in a world where perception is often distorted by comparison, proportion is what brings things back into focus.